So when I think about the extended workforce, I'm not just thinking about contingent labor, contingent workforce in the gig economy from a freelancer perspective. I think about the entire non-employee population and how that segments into different components that enable organizations to get work done. To solve for that type of philosophical or solve for that type of big population, if you will, it requires, I think, a supply chain like mindset and philosophy. In the same way you need to track goods across the globe, you need to track productivity in workers. Who are they? Where are they? What are they doing? Who do they work for? How much do they cost? The reason I think about that from a supply chain perspective is because that's my background. When I was working in my previous firms, I grew up in the supply chain and operations space. I landed in procurement transformation where things just clicked and made sense. So I continued to invest my time in that, seek out projects in that. And I was able to grow in my companies in that space. And I was able to land some projects focused on category strategy for contingent labor,
Right.
so helping procurement organizations work with their HR, IT, legal, and business partners to figure out how do we get better control and visibility around spend, and how do we enable businesses to make the right decisions to get the work in the door that they need to get done. And over the course of time, we were able to build one project into multiple projects where we were tackling these big global problems around extended workforce. And I started to see a challenge. The challenge was a lot of maturity in your, speaking from a procurement mindset, contingent labor category, good control, services in place, and a desire or a need, an expectation to expand into more external labor and services categories, but challenges with the approach. And those challenges were essentially taking the contingent labor mindset or strategy and trying to apply them into professional services such as
Yeah.
management consulting, IT professional services, and maybe even in some categories where there was more complex labor involved, such as where your factory shift-based workers were. And I think the challenge with that was organizations or teams that were aligned around the contingent labor category are being challenged with using the same tools, the same service providers, the same strategy and approach that worked in contingent labor in different categories that have different stakeholders, different needs, different process variances, which creates different process complexity, and therefore the solution is not coming fast enough. The business case is being lost, and therefore the ROI is um, is not being achieved. I've seen that happen multiple times across multiple clients and across multiple categories. For a long time, this article has been sitting in my head. And when the time came for me to start my own business, start my own firm, which is something I want to cross this part out. When the time came for me to begin Featherston Lee, it was the first article I was ready to write. It was already in my head. I'd been mulling over it for years.
Yeah. And it's interesting listening to you talking about the kind of disconnect
Yeah.
between what was going on in this quite specific contingent labor category and extending that out into broader kind of extended capacity and capability within organizations, external service providers working on an output or outcome basis, or maybe on KPIs and SLAs, for example. Do you think you mentioned some of the differences? One of the things I always think as well is talking about different stakeholders, different processes, different technology requirements, and things like that. I sometimes feel that there's also a language barrier that certain things can get slightly lost in translation when people are, and I completely agree with you, hitting problems because they're coming at it with a contingent workforce mentality. Do you think there's that kind of like terminology barrier to a certain extent?
One of the things I just gave this feedback to a service provider, and one of their in a message was the there's certainly I have an issue with terminology when companies say we can tackle extended workforce and do SOW services procurement, but then they use words like individual and assignment. and candidate.
An
To
interview.
me, yeah, to me, I would look at them or I would look at a client and say, I'm not confident your service provider understands your use case, the problem statement that you are trying to solve for. I come from a world of management consulting. We were made up of teams of people, not always working full time on the project, on a blended rate card, delivering against an outcome or deliverable. The narrative that is positioned into how a technology or service provider is able to enable services procurement isn't fitting that use case. Isn't I would not have been applicable in my big consulting days to the solution that's being presented. Is that a fit? Is there a product market fit there? So I certainly think that's one of them. And I think the other challenge is, quite frankly, category expertise.
Mm,
If you think about the the stakeholders who need to use management consulting from a strategic perspective, they have a different need and they're different levels of influence at the company. Those category leaders are also very different than the contingent labor leader. They may sit in the same team, but their stakeholders are different. Therefore, their thinking about the solution is different. So all categories, I think, Johnny, follow a life cycle. And organizations need to build an ecosystem of solution providers and technologies that fit the natural life cycle of that category. When it's time to go to market, when it's time to operationally manage, who are the suppliers that feeding into that, and how does specific technology, quite frankly, enable the business to self-serve
mhm.
in managing how they get work done.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you make in terms of the specificity, but also the fact of the ultimate objective is to enable the business to self-serve. It's being a technology vendor in this space. In the early days, our approach was much more talking to procurement about how we could help solve their problems, make them more efficient, save them time, create greater savings, and all that sort of thing. But what we've come to realize just through the market feedback, the important thing for organizations and actually for procurement teams to be able to help their organizations achieve is to actually make it easier for the end user, make it easier,
Yeah.
make it more compliant, make it faster, allow them to buy with value in mind, all this sort of thing. And that's
Hmm.
that's exactly what you're describing in the sense that it is about the end user. And ultimately, this comes back to your original point about this is about how organizations get work done. And if they can't get the work done effectively through whatever channel they need to do the work, they are not going to be able to compete in the market. And
Yep.
that's with such a fast moving, such a volatile market. If you can't get the best suppliers, if you can't work with them, speed to market, all these things, it's critically important.